Tonight, drift back to the earliest years of a medieval life. Picture a low stone cottage on the edge of a village in the north of England, the year 1220, the fire burning close and steady in the central hearth, the dark outside total and unbroken. A new child has come into the world this morning, and the cottage is warmer than usual because of it. Wood fed on with unusual generosity, the usual careful rationing of fuel set aside for this one morning. The child is wrapped in tight linen bands from shoulders to toes and lying in a wooden cradle that rocks slowly beside the warmth. The nurse is singing something very soft, a syllable repeated over and over, half Latin and half no language at all. The kind of sound a voice makes when the words have stopped mattering and only the rhythm remains. The child's eyes are closed. The cradle moves in its small arc. The fire settles with a soft sound into itself. This is how a medieval childhood began, and in its way it is not so different from how childhood has always begun. A small, warm, helpless person. A fire. A voice. The same ingredients, the same quiet miracle, repeated in every century before and since. But what came next was different in ways that are worth knowing. The games were different. The work was different. The school, if there was one, was different in almost every detail from anything you would recognize. The path toward adulthood was steeper and earlier and shaped by rules of rank and obligation that governed every hour of a child's days. From the morning they were first swaddled to the morning they stood in a manor court and heard their name read aloud as a grown person. Tonight, settle in beside that fire. The medieval world was also, always, full of children, running across village commons in the morning light, bent over wax tablets in cold schoolrooms, turning shuttles in smoky workshops, driving geese down muddy lanes before breakfast. By today's standards, children were handed responsibility early, and the world asked a great deal of them. By medieval standards, they were simply growing up in the only way growing up happened. Let their world come slowly into focus around you. Let it settle and soften. Let it carry you gently toward rest. You are in a low-ceilinged cottage on the edge of a village near Selby, in Yorkshire, the year 1220. The fire burns close and steady, built higher than usual, because a child was born this morning, and the cold is the first enemy any new person meets in this world. The rushes on the floor smell of damp and old hay. The tallow candle makes the shadows move slowly across the plaster wall. There is the smell of the fire, of wet wool drying near the hearth, of something warm and sweet in the small iron pot. The midwife has gone. The nurse is here now, a woman of perhaps 40 with thick, capable hands and a voice that seems built for low, continuous sound. A voice like the fire itself, steady and warm and not going anywhere. She is unwrapping the child from its birth cloth and beginning the work of swaddling, which is a craft with its own logic, requiring practice and a confident touch that cannot be acquired by instruction alone, but only by doing. The linen bands are already prepared, perhaps 4 yards of clean cloth, warmed near the fire, torn from material that has been used before and will be used again. She begins at the feet. She wraps firmly, overlapping each pass of the band, binding the legs together, the arms at the sides, the torso, up to the shoulders, leaving only the head free. The child does not seem to enjoy this. The nurse does not seem surprised. She keeps wrapping. This was the way of things almost everywhere in medieval Europe, from the cottages of the poor to the curtained chambers of queens. The swaddled infant was the universal shape of a very young child, a small, firm bundle that could be set upright in a corner, hung from a peg, or placed rocking in its cradle without the risk of a flailing arm or a tumbling leg. The belief behind the practice was earnest and not unreasonable by the knowledge of the time. Human limbs, soft and unformed, needed support and direction to grow straight. The bands would guide the bones as they hardened. The body would become, through this patient wrapping, correct. Physicians approved. Midwives practiced it. Mothers expected it. It was the default shape of a very new person from one end of the continent to the other. There were no infant development milestones pinned to a health visitor's wall, no pediatric charts to consult, no temperature-controlled nursery with a breathing sensor on the windowsill, and definitely no white noise machine waiting on a bedside table with preset settings. What there was, a fire, a nurse, a cradle, and the accumulated knowledge of every woman in the village who had ever handled a newborn before and who had learned what worked by the only method available, doing it. The nurse knew what she was doing. She had done it many times, and the knowledge in her hands was not something words alone could have given her. The swaddling was changed daily, or twice daily if the household was prosperous enough to have the linen for it, and if the nurse was diligent, which she was expected to be. The baby was unwrapped, washed in warm water, rubbed with a little salt and oil to toughen the skin, sometimes dusted with fine powder ground from dried rose petals, then re-wrapped with the same careful attention as before. The process was a morning task, unhurried, accompanied by the kind of murmured commentary that nurses produced without apparent effort, that you are a good child, that the bands will not be tight for much longer, that the fire is warm today and the wind has stopped. Bartholomeus Anglicus, the great encyclopedist writing in the 13th century, described the ideal nurse as rejoicing when the child was joyful, being sorrowful when the child wept, and taking the child up when it fell. He also specified that she should have sufficient milk, that she should be of steady temper and good health, that she should chew the child's food when the child was old enough for soft morsels, and that she should keep the cradle clean. The picture he drew was tender rather than clinical, and it matches what other sources suggest, that the care of very young children was taken seriously, performed with attention, and regarded as requiring genuine skill. The cradle stood near the fire. In a poor household, it might be a simple wooden box on rockers, unadorned, stained with years of use. In a prosperous household, it might have curtains and a canopy to keep off draughts, and perhaps a small carved figure on the hood. It was rocked by the nurse's foot while her hands were occupied elsewhere, mending, spinning, watching the fire. The rocking was not optional. Bartholomeus described it as medicine for the infant's soul, something that calmed the humours and settled the blood into its proper rhythm. The nurse sang while she rocked. The medieval lullaby tradition is one of the oldest continuous threads in English literature. Syllables recorded as early as the 12th century, half Latin, half vernacular, something like lulle, lulle, little child, repeated until the meaning dissolved into rhythm and the rhythm dissolved into sleep. The sound was the point. The voice in the dark was the first reassurance, the first signal that the world outside was known and watched. A child who has a voice nearby is a child whose nervous system can settle. That is not a medieval discovery. It is a fact about mammals that precedes the medieval period by a very considerable distance. The first great crisis arrived within a day or two of the birth. The child had to be baptized. This was not a ceremony that could be deferred for convenience. The unbaptized soul had no standing, no name, no protection, no place in the community of the faithful, and if it died in that condition, it could not be buried in consecrated ground. The urgency was genuine, the fear behind it real, rooted in a theology that was not abstract but lived, felt in the bones of every person in the village as present and immediate as the cold. Parents sometimes ran to the church with the child wrapped against the weather, making the journey within hours of the birth. If the baby was dangerously ill, a midwife or neighbour could baptize at home, dipping a hand in water and speaking the necessary Latin words. But the formal christening, at the font, with godparents present, with the priest and the community, was the true beginning of a person's existence in the eyes of the church and of everyone around them. You were not fully real, in the deepest medieval sense, until you had been named and signed with water and enrolled in the parish record. The christening gown was the child's first gift, usually provided by the godparents, usually white, sometimes carefully embroidered if the family had means. The godparents were chosen with deliberate care, because the relationship of spiritual kinship created at baptism was a permanent bond. Among the peasantry, a godparent might be a somewhat more prosperous neighbour, someone with a small reserve of influence that might one day be useful when the child was grown. Among the gentry, a godparent might be a lord or a churchman, a tie of patronage woven into the sacrament from the very beginning. The choice said something about the family's aspirations. The christening ale followed because almost every significant event in a medieval community was followed by communal eating and drinking, and a new child was significant. Alongside the baptism, the infant acquired its first material protections. A small piece of polished coral was pressed into the cradle or hung around the neck. Red coral, smooth enough to serve later as a teething tool, and believed by genuine popular conviction to pale or change colour if the wearer fell ill. It was a diagnostic instrument as much as an amulet, and it was also, once the teeth began, genuinely useful in the way that smooth, hard objects are genuinely useful to a child cutting through gum. The coral teething stick is one of those medieval remedies that survive scrutiny. Wrong theory, real relief. The question of nursing is where the social gradient became visible almost immediately. Among the nobility and the prosperous burgess class, a wet nurse was engaged, a woman who had recently given birth herself, who had milk to spare, and who met the careful requirements that every physician and advice text laid out in detail. She should eat well, but not richly. She should avoid garlic, strong ale, anything sour or sharp that would sour or thin the milk. She should be calm in temperament and good in character, because the milk was understood as the mother's nourishment passing through another body, and everything that body consumed or felt would pass into the child. Among peasant families, the mother nursed her own child, because the wet nurse was an expense entirely beyond reach. This meant nursing through the exhaustion of field work and household management, through successive pregnancies, through the whole weight of an unspared life. You nursed because you had to, and because the child was yours, and because those two things were not in conflict. By the time a medieval child was 2 or 3, it was on its feet, wearing a long linen shift, beginning to eat pottage thinned with broth. It had a name. It had godparents who visited. It had a small piece of coral on a cord. The world was very warm, very small, very full of the voice of one woman who rocked and sang anew, without needing to reason it through. That warmth and sound and consistency were the materials from which the world was made for a very young person. The fire crackled. The cradle moved in its slow arc. The nurse's song continued past the point where the child had stopped hearing the words and begun to sleep. That was the point. The song was not for the child anymore. It was for the night to hear. A small, continuous signal that someone was awake, that the fire was tended, that the dark outside this warm and smoky room had been noticed, acknowledged, and was being kept at the door. The world the swaddled infant was entering was one that had a clear idea of what a child needed, even if that idea was expressed differently than a modern person would express it. Warmth was medicine. The voice was medicine. The nearness of a body was medicine. None of this required a theory of attachment or a developmental psychology textbook to arrive at. It required only the observation, accumulated across generations, that the children who received these things survived at higher rates than the children who did not. The medieval nurse who rocked and sang and kept the fire was practicing what worked, on the basis of evidence that was not written in any journal, but was written in the lives of the children she had cared for and the memories of the women who had cared before her. The first weeks of a medieval child's life were also the most dangerous. Infant mortality in this period was high. Roughly 1 in 3 children, by most estimates, did not survive to their 5th birthday, and a substantial proportion of those deaths occurred in the first month. The causes were multiple: infection, exposure, difficult births, the complications of prematurity, the ordinary vulnerability of a small body without reserves. By today's standards, the absence of antibiotics alone placed newborns at extraordinary risk from infections that would today be trivial to treat. The parents knew this. They baptized quickly because they had seen what happened when the delay was too long. They built the fire high because they had watched cold take a newborn in the night. They chose the godparents carefully because a child without strong connections to the world was a child who might not survive in it. Every precaution was a response to a real danger. The coral was an amulet, and equally a reminder that the child was not yet secure. The christening was a sacrament, but it was also a practical defense against the worst of what could happen. The swaddling was a theory about bone growth, but it was also a method of keeping a small body from rolling off a surface, from flailing an arm into the fire, from moving in ways that unsupervised infants in unprotected spaces could not afford to move. The medieval child who survived the first year and the second and made it to the age of 7 or 8 was not a lucky child. They were a child tended with the full application of everything the world knew about keeping small people alive. The knowledge was different from what we know now. The tools were different. The outcomes were less reliable. But the love behind the effort was the same love that has always been behind the effort in every century and every place, and it was applied with the same intensity and the same daily repetition and the same willingness to wake at 3 in the morning and build up the fire, because that was what the fire needed, and the fire was what the child needed, and the child was everything. You are 7 years old. It is early June in a village in the Midlands near Coventry, the year 1286. The sky is already pale when your mother shakes your shoulder. The fire has been going since before you woke. You can hear the pot settling above it. The floor is packed earth, cool under your feet when you climb off the straw mattress, and the smell of the morning. Damp thatch, yesterday's smoke, the cool green presence of the field coming in under the door, is the smell of every morning you have ever woken to. Your job today, as it has been for the past 2 summers, is bird scaring. You take the wooden clapper from behind the door, 2 flat boards hinged loosely together that make an alarming crack when you swing one sharply against the other, and you go out into the field before the dew has dried. The grain has been in the ground for weeks. The rooks come from the east at first light, black and purposeful and entirely committed to eating what was planted. Your job is to walk the rows and make noise continuously for as long as the birds are flying, which means most of the morning. There is no adult supervising you. You are expected to be there and expected to do it, and the consequences of not doing it are understood. The birds eat the seed, the crop is thin, the autumn is hard. The chain of consequences was not explained at length. You understood it the way you understood most things in this world, through the expression on your mother's face when you got it wrong. Bird scaring was a canonical small child's task, recognized across medieval England as work suited to the smallest available hands. It required no particular strength, no complex skill, only persistence and the willingness to keep moving and keep making noise. Children did it from about 5 years old. A 5-year-old could swing a clapper. A 5-year-old could shout. These were the primary qualifications. The good news is that it was outdoor work, in the long light of a summer morning, with no one watching and the sky enormous above you. The bad news is that it ran from first light until the birds gave up for the day, and the birds were patient with a persistence that was, at times, almost personal. You and the rooks, face to face across the rows of grain, playing out the oldest negotiation in agriculture. Between the demands of the field, a peasant child moved through a life of small sequential tasks. You drove the household's geese to the common in the early morning and brought them back before dark. You carried water from the well to the cottage. The well was not far, but the pails were heavy relative to the arms carrying them, and the trip was made 3 or 4 times a day. You collected kindling from the field margins and the wood edge, bundling it across your back on the way home. You helped with the weeding when extra hands were needed, crouching between the bean rows and pulling what was not supposed to be there. You picked up dried dung from the common and the lane for fuel, a task you had always done and therefore did not think about, the way any task present from earliest memory eventually stops being something you notice. By today's standards, such unsupervised freedom given to small children would seem alarming. For the period, it was simply what childhood was. The coroner's rolls. The records of sudden and unexplained deaths investigated across medieval England from the 13th century onward are a particular kind of window into the daily world of peasant children, because children died in the texture of their work and their unsupervised hours, and the roll recorded how. A child of 3 or 4 wandered while the adults were in the field and fell into the ditch that ran behind the cottage. A child of 6 fell from the back of a cart on the road to market. A child of 7 was kicked by a horse while trying to shoo it from the grain. The accidents reveal the landscape precisely: the well with no coping, the cart with no rail, the horse unfenced in the lane. And they reveal the degree to which young children moved through that landscape without an adult's eyes on them at every moment. Barbara Hannawalt, studying these records in detail, found that children aged 2 to 5 drowned most often in ponds and wells, the death rate clustering at precisely the age before a child was old enough to be assigned a task that kept them in one place. Once they were useful, the work itself became the supervision. The bird scaring gave you a field to stay in. The geese gave you a lane to follow. The water carrying gave you a path between well and cottage walked so many times it became a groove in the memory as well as in the ground. The work was not cruelty. It was the world's solution to the problem of a small child with energy and no occupation in a landscape full of hazards and entirely indifferent to small children. By 9 or 10, you knew where the hazards were. You had known them long enough that they had become simply part of the world. The seasons shaped the child's year in ways that had no modern equivalent, because the child was part of the seasonal rhythm, not insulated from it. Spring was for planting, and small hands were useful for pressing seeds into turned soil, for carrying the seed bag, for following behind the plough and breaking the large clods the blade left. Summer was the long busy season: weeding, haymaking, bird scaring, water carrying, the heat building over the fields until the grain was heavy and the air smelled of ripeness. Autumn was the harvest, when every able person in the village turned out regardless of age, and a child's contribution was real, carrying sheaves, following the reapers, gleaning the stubble field afterward to pick up the ears the scythe had missed. Winter was the season of inside work, repairing tools, spinning, mending, and also the season of the greatest relief from field obligation, though the cold made the freedom less comfortable than it sounds. Play was stolen from the margins of all this. Not scheduled, not equipped with dedicated space or adult facilitation, not provided with anything beyond what could be found or made. After the morning's tasks, if the chores were done and no one had another thing that needed doing, you might spend an hour before supper on the village common with 4 or 5 other children in a game that had no written rules and changed every time. A wooden ball was passed or chased or struck with a stick. The game was always roughly the same and never quite the same, which is true of children's games in every century and every place. The seasons also governed what play was possible. In summer, the common was available. the pond in good weather for the daring ones, the long warm evenings lingering into the time between supper and sleep. In winter, the cold drove everyone inside earlier and the games moved to the fireside. Knucklebones, riddles, the small competitive games of who can stay still longest that required only a warm room and two people willing to stare at each other without blinking. The winter dark was long, and the fire was the centre of everything, and even play arranged itself around the light. By today's standards, the transition from bird scaring at 6 to ploughing at 13 is a strikingly compressed passage from childhood to adult responsibility. For the medieval Midlands, it was simply the shape of a working life, arriving at the pace that working lives had always arrived. By 12 or 13, a peasant boy was expected to do a man's range of work. Not a full man's strength, that came later, but the full range of tasks, ploughing, hedging, carting, all the seasonal labour. The body at 12 was close enough to a grown body that the distinction between child work and man work became less practical than ceremonial. And the ceremony was mostly performed by the other men around you, who began one day to address you differently. Not quite as an equal yet, but no longer as a child. One morning, at some point in those years, you simply noticed that the adults were treating you as one of themselves. There was no announcement. No particular day. No ceremony and no examination. The work had grown with you, steadily and without pausing, and the growing had been mutual, and now the work and the person were approximately the same size. That was all there was to the transition. Not a moment, but a noticing, happening long after the thing it named had already become true. The peasant child's relationship with the natural world was more intimate than anything most modern children experience, and it came not from any deliberate philosophy of outdoor education, but from the simple fact that the natural world was where the work was. You knew the field in a way that a field worker knows a field, not its name on a map, but its specific texture, where the drainage was poor and the grain would struggle, where the soil was lighter and responded better to the shallow plough, where the hedgerow gave enough shelter that you could rest out of the wind for 10 minutes at midday without anyone noticing. You knew the weather in its early signs, because the weather mattered to you in an immediate and personal way. The look of the sky at dawn that meant rain by afternoon, the specific smell of the air before a frost, the way the birds behaved when a storm was coming from the west. You knew the animals in the way you know things you have watched every day for years. The temperament of the individual geese you drove to the common. Which one would wander? Which one was reliably directed? Which one had it in for you specifically and would make the walk an exercise in lateral thinking? The sound of the well when it needed rope attention. The way the mud in the lane behaved after rain relative to how it behaved after frost. None of this was knowledge anyone had given you. It was knowledge you had accumulated by being present, day after day, in the same world, attending to it. This was, in its way, a complete education. Not the education of the grammar school or the song school, not the education of the great house or the guild workshop, but the education of a person who would spend their life working a particular piece of land and who needed to know that land with the full depth of attention that survival required. The peasant child who grew into the peasant farmer carried this knowledge as the most fundamental thing they owned, more durable than any tool, more reliable than any memory they might have of a particular summer's game. It was the knowledge of a place, and a place known that way is not easily forgotten. The other children on the common, the ones you had bird-scared beside and driven geese with and played knucklebones against on cold afternoons, they were also part of this education. The village was a community you were learning to live inside, the same way you were learning to live inside the fields, by being present in it, daily, attending to who was who and what was expected and where the lines ran. A child who grew up knowing the village knew who to ask when the plough iron needed attention, and who could be relied on in an emergency, and who would let their geese into your grain if you were not watching. This knowledge was entirely practical. It was also like the knowledge of the field, the knowledge of a life that would be lived in one place, among people who knew each other with the intimacy that proximity and shared difficulty create over years. The village common was also where children encountered the full span of village life. The old men sitting at the boundary stone in the evenings, the women coming back from the well, the men returning from the fields at dusk with that particular exhaustion that is different from the exhaustion of any other kind of work. You understood, by watching and being near, that the adult world you were entering was not a different world from the child's world. It was the same world, continuing. The fire was the same fire. The common was the same common. The faces were the same faces, only older than they had been when you first began to notice them. You were approaching the life from one end, and the life was the same life the people before you had always lived, and the continuity was not oppressive but ordinary in the way the best things are ordinary, taken for granted, present, reliable as the field at the edge of the village and the sky above it. You are 10 years old on a grey December afternoon in 1293 in the market square of a Cotswold town. The traders have packed up early because of the cold. The cobblestones are slick with frost at the edges. You have, in your coat pocket, 4 knucklebones, the small, dense ankle bones of a sheep, worn smooth from handling, off-white and solid in the palm. You have been carrying them since the summer. They are your most reliable possession. More reliable than the hoop, which got dented and rolls badly now. More reliable than the wooden ball, which has developed a split and now bounces sideways in a way that makes it more interesting but less useful. The knucklebones work in any weather, on any surface, and require no partner, which is useful on afternoons when partners are unavailable. You toss them, catch them, build the small, precise games of chance and skill that knucklebones have always made possible, going back through the medieval centuries and behind them into Rome, and behind Rome into the ancient world. The same bones served the same purpose in every century, because it turns out that people who are 10 years old have always wanted something to do with their hands. The word jack, as in the game of jacks, descends directly from this practice. The bones are gone, the game persists. The medieval child's world of play was narrow in manufactured objects and wide in what the imagination and the available materials could do. The toys that survive, in collections drawn from London excavations, from Thames mud, from the occasional careful grave where a small possession was buried alongside the small person who owned it, are specific and illuminating. Small wooden horses, wheeled and painted, pulled on a string by a child too young for the real animal, clay whistles shaped like birds, functional enough to produce an actual note when you held them correctly and blew across the opening, miniature kitchen vessels in lead tin alloy, stamped out in the shapes of tiny jugs and bowls. The obvious toys of a child who has watched adults cook and who wants to do the same on a manageable scale, which is every child in every century. And the hobby horse, the carved wooden horse head mounted on a stick, which appears in manuscript illuminations across 13th and 14th century Europe, with the cheerful consistency of something that was genuinely universal. Boys are shown astride their stick horses in the page margins of psalters, galloping through the white space below the text, occasionally being regarded by a saint who appears mildly puzzled. The hobby horse needed no manufacturing process beyond shaping a rough head from a piece of wood and finding a stick to mount it on. It cost nothing. It was everywhere. The games that required no equipment at all were equally widespread. Hot cockles was a blindfold game. One player knelt with eyes covered and hand extended. The others took turns striking the outstretched palm, and the kneeling player had to identify who had struck them. It required neither tools nor preparation, only a group of children and an afternoon. Nine Men's Morris was scratched into church porches, cathedral floors, and the soft stone of cloister walls across England and Europe. A grid game of placement and capture that adults and children played together, the evidence preserved in the actual carved boards that remain in medieval stone to this day. You can still find them if you know where to look. The porch of the parish church was where people gathered on warm afternoons, and the game boards in the paving were the marks of accumulated hours of ordinary human beings with a piece of stone and time on their hands. In winters when the marshes outside London's walls froze solid, and there were several such winters in this period, the boys and young men of the city were on the ice with cattle shin bones strapped to their feet. William Fitzstephen described this in his account of London written around 1183, and the practice he documented was old when he described it and continued long after. The shin bones were tied with leather straps and smoothed on their flat side. Iron-tipped poles provided propulsion by pushing against the ice. Fitzstephen noted that the skaters moved as swift as a bird in flight, and that when two of them collided at speed, the impact was impressive enough to break the ribs of anyone unlucky enough to receive it. The shin bone was not a poor substitute for a proper skate. It was the available technology of the northern winter, and it worked well enough that the same technique remained in use across northern Europe until purpose-made iron skates arrived and gradually replaced what bone and strap and ingenuity had provided. By today's standards, skating on cattle bones down a frozen marsh with an iron-tipped pole and no protective equipment whatsoever is a somewhat casual approach to winter sport. By modern standards, the absence of any safety provision at all would close the activity immediately. In 1293, it was what you did when the water froze and the afternoon was free and the pole was at the door. The toys manufactured for purchase, for children whose parents had access to a market and a small surplus, were produced in the same workshops that made other small metal and ceramic goods. The London clay whistle, shaped like a bird, fired in a kiln and painted, found in excavations below Cheapside, dates to the 13th century. It made a sound. It was a bird that fit in your pocket. A child blew it in the street, and the adult nearby thought, "I see." That kind of afternoon. There were also wooden spinning tops, wound with a cord and set spinning by a sharp pull, iron hoops rolled with a stick, balls made of inflated pig's bladder, which was light and free and bounced in an unpredictable way that made the chasing of it genuinely interesting. No specialist toy shop, no branded packaging, and definitely no batteries required or included. The Shrove Tuesday football game in towns like Alnwick and Chester was an event on a different scale from any private game. The ball, the pig's bladder, was brought out, and what followed involved the entire male population above the age of perhaps 8, with goals that might be a mile apart and rules understood primarily in their absence. Children ran in the outer margins of the crowd, too small to participate fully but large enough to want to, contributing noise and the particular quality of energy that small people bring to chaos they cannot quite control but very much want to be near. The game had the quality of sanctioned disorder, the understanding that this was the day for it, and that after the day was done the town would resume its normal order, somewhat dishevelled. The church, unexpectedly, is also a witness to children's play. Penitential texts of the 12th and 13th centuries note, with weary patience, that children played church, appointing one of their number as priest, the others as congregation, going through the gestures of liturgy with farmyard materials. A chicken might be baptized. The penitentials do not appear greatly alarmed by this, which suggests it was familiar enough to require only gentle discouragement. The more interesting reading is that the children were paying very close attention during the actual Mass, close enough to replicate it afterward with some accuracy, which was precisely the effect the Church was attempting to produce by bringing children to the liturgy from the earliest age. The play was not mockery. It was the highest compliment available. You close your hand around the knuckle bones in your pocket. The market square is empty now. The cold has sharpened into something with intentions. You find 3 other children sheltering from the wind at the wall's south side, and without much discussion the 4 of you sit down on the cold stone and arrange the bones between you. The game does not require warmth. It does not require light beyond what the grey afternoon provides. It requires bones and hands and a cold afternoon with nothing in particular pressing. The game begins. The knuckle bones click against the cobblestones with a small, precise sound, and the sound is the same sound they would make in Rome, and in Athens before Rome, and in the streets of 100 other times and places that also had children and bones and cold afternoons, and the indestructible human impulse to play with whatever the world has left within reach. Play in medieval England was not a special category of life reserved for children. Adults played too, at chess and tables and meals, at the seasonal games attached to feast days, at the dicing and card games that churchmen periodically and unsuccessfully attempted to discourage. The line between adult recreation and children's play was more permeable than it became in later centuries, because the medieval world had not yet decided that play was primarily a developmental activity to be scheduled for children and then outgrown. The old man playing meals in the church porch was not reverting to childhood. He was doing what people have always done with a stone surface and an afternoon, making a game. The seasonal games were a calendar unto themselves. Shrove Tuesday football, as noted, was the largest and most violent. May Day brought the maypole. Children and adults dancing together around a decorated pole, a practice whose precise origins are lost but whose vitality is not. Midsummer bonfires drew everyone in the village, children running through the smoke for luck, the fire itself as tall as a man. Harvest home in September involved singing, the communal meal, and dancing of the kind that required no instruction and no partner of any particular age. The ritual year was also the play year, and the children were in all of it. Medieval children also played at the edges of adult culture, at the margins of the fair, the market, the tournament when a tournament came to the district. The tournament was not primarily a spectacle for children, but children watched from whatever vantage they could find, which was usually the ground and the narrow spaces between adults. The sight of a joust stayed in a child's memory for years. The horses, the lances, the noise, the dust, the particular quality of a crowd that is genuinely uncertain about what is going to happen next. The fair was perhaps the most various and extraordinary thing a child who lived in a small village might encounter in the early years of their life. A major fair, the Stourbridge Fair at Cambridge or the St. Giles Fair at Oxford, brought merchants from across England and sometimes from the continent into one field for several days. There were goods from places the child had never heard of and might never visit. There were foods not available at home. There were entertainers, tumblers, bear wards, minstrels, jugglers, performing the kind of spectacle that was, in a world without any form of recorded performance, genuinely impossible to encounter anywhere except here, on this day, in this field. The child watching a tumbler at the Stourbridge Fair had no frame for what they were seeing beyond the unmediated experience of a person doing something with their body that seemed impossible. The fair visited once a year. It was, therefore, a marker in the child's calendar, a fixed point of extraordinary density around which the ordinary year arranged itself. Before the fair and after the fair, as distinct as before Christmas and after Christmas, with the fair itself standing apart from ordinary time as occasions do when they happen rarely enough to remain genuinely charged. You remembered fairs the way you remembered feast days and particular winters, and the year the flooding covered the lower field. They were the bright points in the continuous cloth of days, and the cloth needed them because brightness is only visible against the plain ground of ordinary time. You are 10 years old in the December of 1293, and the afternoon is ending, and the knucklebones must go back in the pocket. The other children drift toward home and supper. The cold has definitively arrived, the kind of cold that suggests it has no intention of leaving until spring. You stand up, brush the frost from your coat, and begin the walk home through streets that are narrowing in the early dark. The fire will be going when you get there. The pottage will be on the pot. Your mother will not ask what you have been doing, because she already knows that you have been doing what you always do when there is a free afternoon and a pocket of knucklebones, which is to say, playing in the specific way that 10-year-olds play in December, which requires very little but delivers, as it always has, a great deal. You are 7 years old and you are leaving home. The cart is loaded with your trunk, a small one containing 2 changes of linen, a winter cloak, a pair of leather shoes that are nearly new, a book of psalms that your mother wrapped in cloth and placed at the bottom this morning, and a small painted wooden horse that you are old enough to know you are too old for, but that you have packed anyway, toward the bottom, under the psalms, in the dark where it will not be the first thing anyone sees when the lid is lifted. The cart waits at the manor gate, Your mother stands in the yard. She is not weeping, but she has the face of a woman who has decided, with some effort, not to. Your father shakes your hand, the hand of a person beginning something serious. The horse stamps once in the cold morning air. The cart moves. This was fostering, and it was the standard mechanism of aristocratic and gentry childhood, practiced throughout medieval England and most of Western Europe with the consistency of something whose logic everyone involved understood well. You did not send your child to another household because you did not love them. You sent them because another household was where the education was, where the French was spoken correctly, where the manners were modelled in daily practice by people who had them, where the patronage network that would shape your child's future was visible and navigable and being built, one connection at a time. The household was the school, and the child who stayed home was the child who fell behind. The receiving household, somewhere on the Welsh borderlands, was that of a lord of substantially greater holdings than your father's. The hall was 3 times the size of anything you had known. The fires were larger. The company at table was louder and more various. There were other boys here, pages like yourself, ranging in age from 7 to perhaps 12, and older squires who moved through the hall with the carefully unremarkable ease of young men who have been somewhere long enough to stop needing to prove they belong. You tried not to let your noticing show on your face. The courtesy texts were already clear on this. A still face was a mark of character, and 7 was old enough to practice it. A page's primary occupation was service, which in practice meant standing in the correct position, doing the correct thing at the correct moment, and learning by continuous observation what correct looked like in this specific household. You waited at table during meals, carrying dishes from the kitchen entry to the high table, refilling cups when they fell below the appropriate level, standing at your appointed position while the Lord ate. You learned to carve, not simply to cut meat, but to perform the formal vocabulary of the carver's art, which had named strokes for every bird and beast, and which was, at a great table, a display as much as a task. You reared a goose. You lifted a swan. You winged a pheasant. If you did not know the word, you had not been trained. If you had not been trained, you were not yet useful. And a page who was not useful was a page who had failed at the fundamental purpose of being there. The lessons were woven into the day. French was everywhere in the great house, the prestige language of the upper class throughout this period. And you heard it from the first morning and were expected to begin speaking it yourself, not through formal instruction, but through the immersion that daily exposure creates when you have no alternative but to swim. The chaplain took the boys for Latin, an hour or 2 in the small room off the solar, the psalter open, the wax tablet ready, the birch rod placed on the table in the way schoolmasters place the birch rod, communicating everything necessary about the consequences of inattention without a word being spoken about it. Chess was taught by one of the senior squires in the evenings. Dancing was taught by a woman. Riding was a continuous practice, improving always, never finished. By today's standards, sending a 7-year-old to live in a stranger's household for years would require forms and assessments and a considerable apparatus of oversight. By medieval standards, it was the accepted mechanism of upward mobility and proper formation, and the household was accountable to the bonds of social reputation rather than to any regulatory body. The courtesy texts of the period addressed the page directly and with the specificity that comes from genuine experience of what boys of 7 do at table when left to themselves. The Boke of Courtesier and the Boke of Nurture, both addressed to young children entering service, specified, "Do not scratch your head at table. Do not wipe your knife on the tablecloth. Do not speak unless spoken to, but when spoken to speak clearly and keep a still face. Do not let your cap fall. Do not look into your cup before you drink. Do not belch in the direction of anyone important." The list is long, the detail precise, and the precision reflects genuine experience. The rules were not arbitrary refinements. They were the readable grammar of rank, the vocabulary by which one person assessed another's formation and training in the first moments of meeting. To know them was to be readable as someone who had been formed properly. To not know them was to be equally readable. The page's education was the family's argument about where it stood in the world. What was being assembled, piece by piece, was a set of behaviours that would signal throughout the rest of your life what kind of person you were. There was no academic record, no assessment portfolio, no transcript that a future employer would check. There was only the visible quality of your conduct in a room. Whether you knew where to stand, whether you knew the word for what the carver did to a swan, whether you kept a still face while the hall around you was loud. These were the measurements. They were taken continuously by everyone present, and the scores were never written down but were never forgotten either. For noble girls, the path ran parallel but landed differently. A girl of 7 might be fostered to a great noblewoman's household where she learned needlework, household management, music, French, and sometimes Latin, the accomplishments that would make her a useful wife for a man of rank. By modern standards, a curriculum designed entirely around preparing a child for marriage would be considered insufficient preparation for a full life. For the period's expectations, this was comprehensive. It covered the skills the role required, and the role was the life. She might alternatively be placed as a boarder in a nunnery, which was, in England, the institution with the best female literacy available. The nunneries regularly housed the daughters of noble families as fee-paying guests. Not novices, not contemplatives, but girls in a supervised and structured environment, learning alongside the sisters without committing to the sisters' vows. Bishop Richard Poore, in his injunctions to the nuns of Tarrant Nunnery in 1218, found it necessary to specifically forbid the boarders from bringing in large numbers of dogs and young birds. The puppies and the small birds were a persistent problem. The noble girls were entirely unwilling to leave their animals behind, and the sisters found it difficult to maintain the atmosphere of prayer that the rule required when a small spaniel was investigating the altar and a starling had escaped from its cage and was examining the psalter from above. The bishop's irritation is charming evidence. These were real girls in a real place, with real attachments to real animals, trying to get through the day in a nunnery, doing its best to serve simultaneously as a school and as a house of prayer. The Lizzle letters, written in the 1530s but describing a practice continuous with the medieval period, show parents writing to the households where their children were placed with anxiety that is entirely recognizable. Lady Lizzle sent gifts, inquired about clothes, asked after her children's welfare with the mixture of love and practical concern that parents write with when the child is elsewhere, and they cannot see for themselves whether things are all right. The system was educational and strategic and social, and it was also, always, people who loved their children sending them away because the world required it, and writing letters across the distance because that was the only way to close it. The small painted wooden horse, packed at the bottom of the trunk under the Psalms, was never taken out at the new household. That would have been wrong in ways that were obvious even at 7. But it was there, in the dark of the trunk, for a long time. A person keeps these things not because they intend to use them, but because putting them in the bag means they are still yours, and that you have not entirely left yourself behind on the morning the cart moved away from the gate. The fostered child grew into the household over months and years, learning its rhythms and its silences, learning where the warm spots were in the hall, and who was worth asking for help, and who was best avoided after supper. The household became familiar, and then became something more than familiar. A place shaped to the specific weight of your presence in it. A place where you knew things that a newcomer would not know. That was, in the end, what the fostering had always been for. Not to make you into something abstract called an educated nobleman, but to make you into someone who belonged in rooms like this one, who could read them and navigate them and, one day, preside over them. The small, still-faced boy who arrived at 7 became, over years, the young man who could be trusted with the cup, with the carving, with the guest, with the Lord's confidence. That was the whole of the education. What the noble child received in the great household that they could not have received at home was something that is very difficult to name precisely and very easy to see in the effect it had. It was a kind of fluency. In the physical culture of rank, in the management of the body in formal situations, in the reading of hierarchies, and the navigation of the complex social environments that a medieval great house constituted. A manor house was not merely a building. It was a dense social system with its own internal politics, its own factions and alliances and unspoken rules, its own economy of favour and obligation. A child who had lived in it for years understood how it worked, not in the way you understand something you have been told about, but in the way you understand something you have been inside. This was the knowledge that could not be bought or rushed. The boy who arrived at 7 would spend several years simply learning to be unnoticed, to do his job correctly without drawing attention to his newness, to move through the hall without inadvertently standing in the wrong place or looking at things he was not yet supposed to see. The invisibility of correct service was itself an achievement. You were doing your job well precisely to the degree that no one was commenting on it. By the time you were 12 or 13, the household had become your world in the way that the village had been the peasant child's world. A complete environment that you knew from the inside, whose moods and seasons you could read, whose demands you could anticipate. You were no longer new to it. You were, in the deepest sense that the word could carry, at home there. Not at home in the sense of the place you had come from at 7, with the trunk and the wooden horse. At home in the sense of a place that had shaped you and that you had shaped, over years, until the fit between you and it was something that could not be undone. The small wooden horse at the bottom of the trunk was still there. You had not looked at it in years. If you had, you might have found it smaller than you remembered, or exactly the right size, depending on who you had become. It is 5:30 in the morning, the autumn of 1280, in Lincoln. The cathedral rises above the city like a cliff of grey limestone, lit on its upper portions by the first thin pallor of a sky that has not quite decided to be day. In a small stone building in the cathedral close, low-ceilinged, furnished with benches and a lectern and a fireplace in which a fire has been laid but not yet lit, 7 boys are assembling, aged between 8 and 12, in various states of wakefulness that range from merely bleary to something approaching philosophical resignation. You are among them. The song school master comes in, carrying a candle and the birch rod. He sets the candle on the lectern. He sets the rod on the bench beside it. He does not look at anyone in particular, because he does not need to. The boys are standing by the time he reaches the lectern. This is your 2nd year in the song school, and the shape of the morning has become familiar enough to be almost a comfort. The predictability of what comes next provides its own kind of warmth. The way a road you have walked many times is less cold than an unknown one. The first task is matins. You sing the office before the lessons begin, because the primary purpose of the song school is to staff the cathedral choir with trained treble voices, and the office must be sung, and you are the voices. The psalms come up from memory rather than from reading. By this point in your 2nd year, you know 40 of them in sequence, the Latin words worn smooth by repetition, the tongue and the soft palate forming them without the conscious mind being much involved, the way a prayer said every morning of your life eventually says itself. The sound is clear in the cold room. 7 boys' voices, rising through stone walls toward a ceiling that returns them changed. The Latin means, "I will lift up mine eyes to the hills, from whence cometh my help." It means, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." It means, "Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord, Lord, hear my voice." The boys know what the words mean because the master has told them, but the meaning has been absorbed into the music, and what is being produced in this cold room before day has fully arrived is not primarily an act of comprehension. It is sound offered into the available air, and the cathedral beyond the close receives it the same way it receives the wind. After matins, the lessons. The Psalter was the primer, the book from which you learnt to read. This was the standard medieval method of teaching literacy across Europe, applied with the practicality of something that worked. Learn the sounds first, by singing them until they are in the body. Then introduce the written symbols. The connection between what you already know by sound and what you now see on the page forms with considerably less effort than it would if the sounds were unfamiliar. You had been singing these words before you could read them, and so the reading was recognition rather than construction from scratch. It is, in retrospect, a reasonably coherent approach to literacy, even if no one at the time articulated it in those terms. The wax tablet was your notebook, a flat board coated in dark wax, held in a wooden frame, written on with a pointed stylus, and smoothed flat again with the flat end of the same tool when the exercise was complete. No paper. Paper was scarce and expensive in 13th century England, and parchment was not wasted on schoolboys' practice. The wax was cheap, reusable, and forgiving where parchment was not. Your letters were large and uncertain at first, gradually smaller and more precise as the months accumulated. There was no pencil case, no A4 notebook, no lined paper, and definitely no calculator for the arithmetic, which was done on a counting board or in the head, and which the song school handled only at the level of the proportions necessary for music. By today's standards, a schoolroom where a birch rod was kept on the lectern as a matter of course would not remain open long. In the 13th century, the rod was a standard instructional instrument, as expected in a school as the psalter itself. The master's rod was present and used. This fact belongs in the record without either apology or drama. It was applied to the back of the hand, or sometimes to the shoulders, for inattention, for incorrect answers repeated after correction, for speaking when silence was required. It hurt. The schoolboys feared it. Alexander Neckham, writing in the late 12th century, included the fear of the master as one of the fixed coordinates of the school day, as reliable and impersonal as the cold floor at rising or the darkness at waking. Scholars have debated how severe the medieval schoolroom actually was, and whether the birch was applied with the frequency that later caricature suggests. What is clear from the evidence is that it was present, it was used, and it was understood by all parties to be part of the arrangement. The master was also, in most cases, genuinely knowledgeable and committed to producing correct Latin and correct pitch, and capable of warmth toward boys who were making visible effort. These qualities coexisted in the same man, in the same cold room, and the boys who were there understood the distinction between correction for genuine failure and correction for failure to try. The grammar school was a different institution from the song school, serving boys who were older and had already established basic literacy. At St. Paul's in London, at Winchester, at the Cathedral School at Ely, boys aged 10 to perhaps 16 worked through the curriculum that had been standard since the late Roman period. Donatus's Ars Grammatica, the universal Latin textbook in continuous use for nearly 9 centuries, then Priscian, then the poetry of Virgil and Ovid construed for their Latinity and their moral content. The trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, was the frame around which everything was organized. By today's standards, teaching from the same Latin grammar text for 9 centuries suggests a system that had grown comfortable with tradition. By medieval standards, it suggested a text of such demonstrated value that only a fool would replace it. The Donatus worked. Generations of boys had learned Latin from it. The master who assigned it was not being unimaginative. He was being practical in the way that using a tool that works is practical, and the tool had been working since the 4th century. Learning Latin at this level was not an ornamental accomplishment. It was the access credential for law, for medicine, for theology, for administration, for the Church's vast bureaucratic apparatus, for the chanceries of kingdoms. A boy who emerged from the grammar school able to read and write correct Latin had a door open to him that was not open to anyone without it. The door led to a different world, a world of parchment and seal, of argument and disputation, of the accumulation of scholarly authority that could, in the right circumstances, open further doors. The boarding school boy, if he came from outside the cathedral town, lived with a local family or in a schoolhouse, paying for his keep. His days were regulated, quiet hours, supervised meals, church attendance on feast days. But the city was also outside the door, and cities being what they are, the city's less regulated dimensions were available to the boy willing to absorb the consequences of the master finding out, which the master usually did. You sit on the bench in the cold room, the psalter open before you, the fire beginning to catch behind the grate. The master's candle is the only steady light. Outside, Lincoln spreads down its limestone hill toward the river, and the morning wind comes from the north with a cold intention. Your breath makes a small cloud between your face and the psalter page. The finger moves along the line of text. The voice rises to follow it. And in this cold stone room, in the unremarkable darkness of a November morning 8 centuries gone, something that was not there before begins very slowly, letter by letter, syllable by syllable, psalm by psalm, to exist. Not just in the boy on the bench, but in the space between him and the page, which is where learning lives when it is happening, in the gap between the known and the not yet known that closes, gradually, over years, until one day you look back and cannot see where the gap was. The song school produced, over decades and generations, a steady supply of boys who could read, who could sing, who could manage Latin, at least at the liturgical level, and who could conduct themselves correctly in a formal religious setting. Many of them went no further than this. They served the cathedral's choir, grew their voices, lost their treble in the years around 14 or 15, and were released back into the world with more literacy than most of their contemporaries and a strong back catalogue of psalms. Some went on to the grammar school. A smaller number reached the university. The pyramid narrowed sharply at every level. The boys who spent their early years in song school were, however, changed by it in ways that went beyond the specific skills they had been taught. They had spent years in the discipline of collective sound, in the experience of their individual voice as one element of a larger whole, subject to the demands of the harmony rather than to its own preferences. They had learned to listen as part of learning to sing. They had learned that their voice had to fit into a structure it had not made and could not change, and that fitting into it was itself a skill. This is not a small thing to learn at 8. The schoolboy's day was long, cold, and repetitive, easy to characterize from a distance as purely oppressive and easy to misread. The cold room, the rod, the same text repeated for years. These are the elements that look, from a distance, like suffering. But the testimony of the schoolboys themselves, where it survives, is more various. Many of them describe the school with the feeling that adults describe the places where they grew into themselves. Places of real difficulty that were also real formation, where the difficulty was part of what made the formation real. The Latin they learned was not merely a school subject. It was the language of the church, of law, of medicine, of philosophy, of the administrative apparatus of every kingdom in Europe. To learn, it was to become legible to that entire world, to be able to read and write in the common tongue of learned Europe, to communicate across languages and nations, to access the accumulated scholarship of 15 centuries. The schoolboy sitting on the bench with the psalter open in front of him was, without knowing it, being admitted to a conversation that had been going on for more than 1,000 years, and that would continue for centuries more. The fire in the stone room has caught properly now. The room is warmer. Your breath no longer makes a cloud between your face and the page. The master's candle burns steady on the lectern. Outside, Lincoln is fully awake, the sounds of the city coming up the hill to the close. Carts on stone, voices in the market, the distant sound of work. You are 8 years old and you are learning, and the learning is slow and the room is cold, but the fire is going and the psalter is open and the master's finger is on the line, and that is enough for this morning. The cold room, over months and years, would become as familiar as any other place that a person returns to every morning. The bench that dug into your knee at first became simply the bench. The particular smell of the room, old smoke, tallow candle, cold stone, the specific ink and wax smell of writing materials, became the smell of learning, and the smell of learning stayed with the person long after the learning was done. There is a quality of light from a candle in a stone room in November that is unlike any other light, and the boys who sat in it for years carried that particular quality in the back of their eyes for the rest of their lives. You did not know you were accumulating it. You were only trying to get the Latin right before the master's finger moved past the line you had not yet managed to translate. But the accumulation was happening regardless, layer by layer, the way knowledge always accumulates when you are present and paying attention, and the thing you are learning is real. The cathedral itself was the larger context of the song school's work, and the boys who sang in it understood this in their bodies before they could have expressed it in words. The cathedral at Lincoln, rising above the city on its limestone ridge, was one of the great buildings of England. Vast, cold, lit by the colour that poured through its windows in the morning sun, and entirely different from every other space a boy from a modest household would have occupied. To stand in the choir and sing was to be part of something whose scale exceeded the individual entirely, and the experience of being part of something that large at 8 years old left a mark that was not the same as any classroom lesson. The lesson was Latin. What the cathedral taught was proportion. You have been living in this house for 3 years now, and you still sometimes wake in the morning not knowing, for a moment, where you are. Then the smell of the city comes in through the gap in the shutters. River water, bread from the bakehouse, 2 doors down, horse dung, the particular metallic sharpness of the workshop directly below the room where you slept, and you remember. You are in London. You are 15 years old. You are the goldsmith's apprentice, and the morning has arrived before you were ready for it. The indenture was signed when you were 12. Your father's hand, the master's hand, the guild warden's seal pressed into the wax while you stood nearby and watched without being consulted, because you were 12 and the agreement was between men. The document was specific. 7 years of your service in exchange for food, lodging, clothing sufficient to the season, instruction in the full craft of goldsmithing, and a modest sum at the completion of your term. You were to obey the master in all lawful things. You were not to marry during your term. You were to avoid taverns, dicing houses, and persons of ill reputation. You were not to leave the city without permission. No employment contract, no notice period, no overtime provisions, and definitely no HR department to appeal to if the arrangement felt unreasonable on a particular morning. These were the conditions. Your father agreed to them. That was that. The workshop day began before full light. You came downstairs from the room you shared with the other apprentice, a boy from Essex called Richard who had been here 2 years longer than you, and who therefore knew everything in the specific, slightly exhausting way that a person who has been somewhere 2 years longer always knows everything. You opened the workshop shutters, letting in the grey morning light and the full volume of Cheapside beginning its day. You lit the small forge, a charcoal hearth, shallow and round, with a bellows mounted on the side. The charcoal had been banked with ash from the previous night and needed only careful attention and a few steady pulls of the bellows to begin glowing red. You had learned that the bellows required an even, unhurried rhythm, not frantic pumping, which produced a flutter and a variable heat, but a consistent pull and push that built the glow gradually and held it at the temperature the work needed. You learned this by getting it wrong for approximately 3 weeks at the beginning of your first year, until the master came down one morning, watched you for a moment without speaking, put his own hand on the bellows and showed you. That was most of the instruction in those early months. The master doing the thing correctly in the space beside you while you watched, and then stepping back while you did it again. There were words when words were necessary. Silence was more often sufficient. A goldsmith's craft in the late 14th century required simultaneous precision and patience in proportions that were, at 12, difficult to imagine could be built into a body, but that at 15 you were beginning to understand could be. The bench held engraving tools, a small hammer for chasing and raising sheet metal, files in several grades of fineness, draw plates for reducing wire to progressively smaller diameters, a small anvil mounted in a block of wood, and the scorper, a beveled tool for cutting metal in fine controlled lines. You worked primarily in silver and silver gilt, because not every customer who came to the master's workshop needed pure gold, and the goldsmith served a range of clients from the genuinely wealthy to the comfortably prosperous. Drawing wire was one of the tasks of this third year. You took a piece of silver rod and pushed it through the successive holes of the draw plate, pulling it through with heavy tongs, each hole finer than the last, until the wire was thin enough to coil into the delicate spirals of filigree work. The process required a calibrated sense of pressure. Too little, and the wire would not move. Too much, and it would snap. The threshold between these two outcomes became, over months, something you felt through the tongs and the hand rather than something you calculated. The knowledge moved from the head into the hands, which is where it was supposed to be. This was the whole process. This was what 7 years were for. The meals were at the master's table. Him at the head, his wife at the far end, the children between them, you and Richard on the bench side. The food was plain: bread, ale, pottage with some meat on feast days and without meat on fish days, which covered a substantial portion of every year. You were not asked your opinion of the food. You ate it, you were grateful, and the interaction at table was conducted with a formality that kept the household operating without requiring everyone to like each other every morning. The master was not unkind. He was precise. He registered the gap between what the work should have been and what it was with an expression that communicated the entire assessment without a word. Running errands was a large part of the apprentice's daily life. Delivering finished pieces to customers, collecting materials from the merchants around Cheapside, carrying messages between craftsmen who collaborated on large commissions. The city was the other workshop, the other classroom, and you learned it the way the city was learned, by walking it daily over years, building a map in the body rather than on paper. You knew which turnings led where. You knew which chandlers had the best beeswax, which drapers had cloth worth buying, which tailors finished their work on the day they promised, and which would have it ready in 3 more days and be surprised to be asked about it. You knew the city the way the city was learned, by living in it, daily, over years, accumulating knowledge that had no name and could not be purchased separately from the years. By today's standards, a 7-year indenture signed at 12 with no possibility of early exit and no recourse against a difficult master would require some adjustment before it met modern employment law. In the late 14th century, it was the settled mechanism by which a skill that lived in one master's hands was transferred over time into the next generation. The transfer required proximity, repetition, and years, none of which could be shortened without losing what made the knowledge real. The goldsmith's skill was not a set of procedures that could be written down and followed by anyone who had the document. It was a set of judgments and reflexes that lived in the hands, and the hands had to be present, daily, for years in order to acquire them. By modern standards, the apprentice's legal position, bound by indenture, living in the master's house with no independent recourse, would require some careful scrutiny from a labour law perspective. By the standards of the late 14th century, it was the settled mechanism of craft transmission, and most apprentices lived within it and came through it with their craft and themselves intact. The journeyman day came at the end of it. 7 years complete. The formal release acknowledged by the guild. You could now work for wages, move between workshops, begin the accumulation of experience and savings toward your own establishment. The masterpiece, the work submitted to the guild wardens for their judgment, was still ahead, the final formal threshold. The wardens examined the work in silence. They gave their verdict. No examination board, no results letter, no certificate of completion in a folder. The work, the eyes on it, the verdict. The journeyman who walked London's streets after 7 years walked them with a somewhat different posture than the boy who had arrived at 12. The work had entered the hands. The hands were now entirely your own. The workshop smell, forged charcoal and metal and the clean sharpness of silver being worked, would remain in your memory for the rest of your life, because the smells of things you learned young stay longer than the learning itself, and they stay exactly as they were, undimmed, available whenever the right thing opens the door to them. You could be 40 and smell a charcoal forge in a street you were walking and be 15 again, instantly, holding the bellows at the steady rhythm the master showed you. The London that the apprentice inhabited was not the city of the wealthy merchant or the powerful churchman. It was the city of the working young, the apprentices of a dozen trades moving through the same streets, recognizable to each other by their guild liveries or their trade-specific tools, by the particular quality of attention they brought to the city's commercial life. They were the city's quickest inhabitants, the ones most often in motion, carrying and delivering and collecting and returning the nervous system of the commercial network that made London work. The guild system that governed all of this was, from a child's eye view, enormous and impersonal. a set of rules and obligations and examinations that stretched from the indenture at 12 to the mastership at 25 or beyond. From a craft perspective, it was a mechanism for maintaining standards across a trade, ensuring that the goldsmith's hallmark meant something, that the customer who bought a silver piece could trust the quality of the metal and the skill of the maker. No Consumer Protection Bureau, no Trading Standards Office, and definitely no online reviews. But the guild mark served a similar purpose, and the system of masters and apprentices and journeymen that produced the mark was the guarantee behind it. The apprentice years were the years in which you discovered what kind of craftsman you were going to be. Some boys arrived at the bench with hands that took to it immediately. The fine motor control, the patience with small repetitive work, the ability to sit still for long hours doing the same motion with the same care. Others found it harder, the hands slower to learn, the patience shorter, the bench work a struggle. The master watched and assessed and adjusted the work accordingly, giving the natural hand more of the delicate work, the slower hand more of the straightforward work, both of them building toward the same destination by different paths. The master's household was a particular kind of family. Not a family of blood, but a family assembled by contract and proximity, with its own hierarchies and its own warmth and its own silences. The master's wife managed the domestic side of the establishment and had her own authority over the apprentices, different from the master's authority over the craft. The authority of the household rather than the workshop, covering meals and bedtimes and the cleanliness of the room upstairs and what happened to the apprentice's shirt when it got torn. The other apprentice, Richard from Essex, was the nearest thing to a sibling available, with all the attendant friction and dependability that the sibling relationship involves. You knew his habits as well as your own. You covered for him when the master asked questions, and he covered for you, because this was one of the unwritten terms of the arrangement. The London street itself was a form of education that the indenture had not specified, but that the city provided freely. Every errand took you through a different neighbourhood, past different trades, through a different section of the city's vast and various life. The cheap side of the 1370s was a street in continuous transaction. The goldsmith's shops open to the street, the merchandise displayed on the counter, the buyers examining and haggling with the practised unhurriedness of people for whom the display of haste was a negotiating disadvantage. You moved through all of this daily, and the accumulated exposure built, without any deliberate intention, an understanding of how commerce worked at the level of the individual exchange. You knew, by your third year, what a fair price looked like, which buyers were likely to return, and which were once only what the goldsmith's hall expected in terms of the mark and the standard. This was business knowledge that no school taught, because it existed only in the doing. The city outside the workshop door was also building the apprentice, in ways the indenture did not specify and the master could not control. London in the 1370s was a dense and various place. The full range of human endeavour compressed into a space that a person could walk across in an hour, the sounds and smells of 50 trades mixing in the streets, the whole texture of a medieval city's commercial and religious and social life pressing in on anyone who moved through it with their eyes open. The apprentice who ran errands through this city was receiving an education in human diversity that no school could have provided, no matter how excellent the Latin. You are 9 years old. It is a still morning in late spring in a village in Kent, the year 1310, and you are sitting on the step outside the cottage door, with a drop spindle turning slowly in your right hand. The distaff is tucked under your left arm, a bundle of carded wool wound around it in loose pale grey clouds. The spindle hangs from the length of yarn you are drafting out with the fingers of your right hand, turning on its haul with a motion that, when it is working correctly, settles into something almost hypnotic, the twist following the drafting fingers upward into the new yarn, the thread growing longer, the spindle descending its slow arc. When it is not working correctly, the spindle falls and the yarn snaps, and you start again without particular drama, because this is not the first time and will not be the last. You have been doing this for 4 years. In the first year you dropped the spindle constantly. The second year, less. By the third year your mother said you could spin and walk at the same time, which was when the skill had become something you owned rather than something you were practicing. The drop spindle is the simplest possible tool for making yarn. A shaft of turned wood, a clay or stone haul at the bottom for weight and momentum, nothing else. It fits in a pocket or a belt loop. It travels everywhere, to the well, on the way to collect kindling, on the way back from driving the geese to the common. Every moment the hands are not doing something else, the spindle can be spinning. Yarn accumulates. Cloth eventually becomes possible. This is how it worked, and it worked because the tools were always with you, and the task had no natural stopping point. There was no downtime in a medieval girl's day, in the sense of time that belonged to no purpose. There was the work, and within the work there were the moments when the hands could do 2 things at once, carrying and spinning, walking and spinning, watching the fire and spinning. A child who had grown up spinning could maintain the spindle's rhythm without conscious attention, which meant her mind and her eyes were free for everything else. The skill had been absorbed so thoroughly it had become invisible, which is what skill does when it is properly learned. By today's standards, a girl's education confined primarily to household skills, with limited access to formal learning and no independent career track, would constitute a significant restriction of opportunity. For the period, it was the preparation considered appropriate and necessary for the life ahead, a life that was real, demanding, and full of consequence. A girl's education in 13th and 14th century England was practical and continuous, with no separation between learning and living. The learning was the life. You learned to spin by being given a spindle early enough that the skill was in your hands before you had any other use for them. You learned to sew by watching your mother sew, and then sitting beside her with needle and worn cloth, practicing stitches until they were reliable. You learned to manage the dairy, skimming cream, pressing cheese, the rhythm of churning, by doing it wrong enough times that right became the easier option. You learned bread by watching it made, repeatedly, until the day your mother stood aside and you made it yourself and it rose as it was supposed to. The hearth fire was the primary classroom, and everything that required heat. The cooking, the dyeing of cloth, the rendering of tallow for candles, the warming of the sick, was managed there by women, and the management was a body of knowledge passed between generations through the hands and the eyes rather than through any text. No recipe book, no measuring cup, no cooking thermometer, and definitely no culinary instruction videos accessed on a device you kept in your pocket. There was the fire, and there was the woman who knew how to use it, and there was you, watching and then helping and eventually doing. The transfer was gradual and largely silent, because there was no need to narrate what was being demonstrated continuously and what you were absorbing through proximity and repetition. Among the peasantry, a girl's literacy was variable and often absent without particular consequence, because the knowledge required for the life she would lead could be transmitted without any reading at all. Among the gentry and the prosperous Burgess families, the picture was different. The Paston Letters of the 15th century, a body of family correspondence from a Norfolk gentry family, notable for its frankness and completeness, include letters written by women who are comfortable with both reading and writing, who manage estates in their husbands' absences, who conduct negotiations and keep accounts. The literacy was there because it was needed. The medieval world's relationship with literacy was not that everyone should have it equally. It was that people should have the skills their particular life required, and for some women's particular lives, reading and writing were among those skills. Among the nobility, a girl's education was more structured and its purposes more legible. She was being prepared for marriage to a man of rank, and that role required specific accomplishments. Needlework of quality, embroidery, tapestry work, fine hemming, was considered a mark of character as much as of skill, evidence of patience and steadiness of purpose. Music at a domestic level, the psaltery or the lute, played well enough to contribute to an evening without embarrassing the household. French, because the upper classes moved between England and the continent, and the language of court was largely French. And the ability to manage a large household, the accounts, the supervision of servants, the organization of stores and provisions, the capacity to make decisions and be obeyed, which was a learned authority and not a natural one. A noblewoman managing an estate in her husband's absence was running something the size of a small business, with no accounting software, no telephone, no one to call if the situation exceeded her authority, and definitely no management consultant to advise on the crisis. She handled it because she had been trained to handle it, carefully and over years. The distaff was the girl's symbol in such thorough association that it left a permanent mark on the English language. At baptism, documented in enough European sources to be credible, a small distaff was placed in the cradle of a newborn girl, while a boy's cradle received a tiny sword or shield. These were not decorations. They were statements of purpose. The female line of a noble family was called the distaff side for exactly this reason. The word for the tool became the word for the entire half of humanity expected to use it, from birth to death, without ever setting it down as a completed task. The distaff side. The spindle side. The side of continuous, necessary, largely invisible work that kept the world clothed and warm. The herb garden was another domain accumulated from early childhood. Not merely the kitchen herbs, parsley, sage, thyme, rosemary, but the medicinal ones, the plants used for the treatment of common ailments, whose properties were known and applied by the women who tended them. The wise woman who treated a fever with chamomile or eased a child's swollen gums with a violet leaf infusion was not practicing formal medicine. She was practicing what her mother had practiced and her mother before her, a knowledge system transmitted through women across generations, available to anyone who had paid enough attention long enough. Girls learned which plants to gather, in which season, dried how, prepared in which manner. The knowledge was empirical and tested by use, and its survival across so many generations was itself evidence that it worked. Not perfectly, not always, but well enough that it was preserved rather than discarded. The girl who would one day be a wife and a mother and a manager of a household was, at 9, already becoming her. Not in any deliberate or conscious way. She was not thinking about it as she sat on the step with the spindle turning. She was thinking about the morning sun and the damp earth scent of the garden behind the cottage and the sound of the geese somewhere down the lane. But the accumulation was happening anyway, as it always does, in the gap between the child you are and the person you are becoming. The spindle turns in the morning light. The yarn grows longer, barely perceptibly, beat by beat. You are 9 years old, and you are learning everything that will be required of you, and most of the learning looks, from outside, exactly like an ordinary morning. The girl's world was also a world of specific textures and specific knowledge that accumulated in layers across childhood. You knew the cloth that your household produced, its weight and weave, which batches of wool had been well cleaned and which had been rushed, how the dye had taken in the most recent batch, and whether it would hold through washing. You knew the kitchen in the same specific way, which pot sat best on the tripod, how the fire needed to be arranged for the long, slow cook versus the quick boil, where the herbs hung, and in what order they had been dried, and which ones were the oldest and needed to be used before they lost their virtue. This was not general knowledge. It was the knowledge of one specific fire, one specific shelf, one specific household, accumulated through years of daily presence. The needle that produced the embroidery on a noble girl's frame was also accumulating a specific kind of knowledge. The hours of close stitch work developed a patience with fine detail that transferred to other domains, to the reading of documents, to the management of accounts, to the supervision of household work, where the ability to see what was correctly done and what was not was precisely this same quality of sustained attentive observation. The skills that seemed merely decorative were training skills that had wider applications. Among the girl children of the village, there was also a body of knowledge about the community itself, the genealogies of the households, the history of particular fields and particular agreements, the relationships between families that determined who could call on whom in an emergency and who owed what to whom. This was transmitted through conversation, through the stories told by older women, through the accumulation of observation. The girl who had been listening at the fireside since she was 3 years old knew things about the village, by the time she was 12, that a newcomer would not know for years. The stories that older women told were not merely entertainment. They were the village's archive, held in spoken form because written form was not available. They contained the memory of a flood that had happened 30 years before the child's birth, and where the water had come to on the lane, and which fields had drained first, and which had stayed waterlogged through spring. They contained the memory of a dispute over boundary strips that had been settled by the Lord's court in a particular way, and why. They contained the genealogies that explained why 2 households on the far side of the common would not, under any circumstances, share a field boundary without a third party present. This was legal memory, practical memory, the kind of memory that kept a community from repeating its own mistakes because someone had stayed awake at the fireside and heard it told. The girl who absorbed it became, eventually, the woman who told it, the chain of transmission unbroken across the decades. There was play in the girls' day too, though it fitted more tightly between obligations than the play of the younger boys who had not yet been given their full set of tasks. In the free hour before supper, you might sit with 2 or 3 other girls on the step of a house that caught the evening sun, the spindles turning automatically, the conversation covering the usual territory of 10-year-old girls in any century in any place. Which family's geese had wandered into the wrong garden, what had happened at the well that morning, the relative merits of the various options, available to you in the way of future life, discussed with the mixture of realism and fantasy that children bring to any subject about which they cannot yet be sure what is true. The spindle kept turning through all of it. That was the point. The hands had a task and the mind could wander, and the yarn accumulated in the gap between obligation and freedom where the best parts of childhood always live. She knew who was ill and who was recovering. She knew which family had had a hard autumn and which had done well at the harvest. She knew which marriages were likely and which were complicated by matters of kinship or property. She knew, as people who live in small communities always come to know, the full human texture of the world she was in. This was not trivial knowledge. In a community where almost everything depended on the quality of mutual support and the reliability of social bonds, the knowledge of who could be relied upon and who could not was practical knowledge of the most important kind. She who possessed it was better prepared for the life ahead than one who had only the skills of hand and not the skills of reading people. The child woke with a fever in the night. You know this because you are the mother, and you have been lying half awake for the past hour, attending to something you could not quite name. The particular vigilance that parents develop, not quite sleeping, monitoring the room by some faculty that operates below the level of named sense. Now you are up, crossing the dark cottage floor to where the child lies on the straw mattress in the corner. Your youngest, 3 years old, a girl with her father's expression when she is determined about something. Her forehead is hot under your palm. Her breathing is faster than it should be. The first thing is the fire. You bring it up from its banked state, the ash lid lifted aside, the coals stirred with the iron, new wood fed on carefully, and the flames rise to fill the room with moving light. The child makes a sound that is not quite crying and not quite sleeping. You settle on the floor beside the mattress with your back against the wall and your hand on the child's forehead, and you begin the long work of watching. Childhood fever was the most common medical event in a medieval household, and also, depending on its cause and the child's constitution, one of the most frightening. The principal killers of children under 5 were the summer flux, diarrhea and dysentery, the diseases of contaminated water and spoiled food in the warm months, and the winter chest ailments, the heavy coughs and laboured breathing that could move, in a small body with limited reserve, from a bad cold to something much worse in the space of a few nights. Measles and smallpox moved through communities in waves, taking children and adults alike but falling with particular force on the very young and the very old. The medieval parent knew this in the bodily way, that people know things they have had to learn at cost. They had watched what illness did. They knew the difference between a fever that would break by morning and one that would not, and the knowledge lived in the reading of a child's skin and breath rather than in words. The remedies were what was available and what had been passed down through the women of the family and the village. You bring the dried chamomile down from the rafter bundle where it has hung since last August, still holding its colour and a faint herbal scent, and steep it in hot water drawn from the pot. You add a small scraping of honey from the earthenware jar on the shelf. You let it cool until it will not burn the child's mouth and hold the cup to the small lips. This was not wishful thinking dressed as medicine. Chamomile infusion genuinely reduces mild fever. Honey is genuinely antimicrobial. The warmth of the liquid is genuinely comforting to a body that is fighting something. The theoretical framework behind the prescription was incorrect. Cold humours to be corrected, imbalances of hot and wet and dry to be restored. And the prescription itself was often right, which describes a substantial portion of medieval medicine. Wrong theory, sound conclusion, because the conclusions had been tested by use across many generations, and the ones that worked had survived, while the ones that did not had been quietly discarded. The path from observation to practice was not the same as the path from theory to practice, but it arrived at many of the same destinations. Bartholomeus Anglicus wrote, in the middle of the 13th century, about the ideal nurse attending a sick child. "She rejoiceth when the child is joyful," he wrote, "and is sorry when the child weepeth, and taketh the child up when it falleth." The picture is tender rather than clinical, and it matches the evidence from wills, from letters, from the miracle records that document what parents did when ordinary remedies had been exhausted. The sick child was held. The fire was built high. The voice was kept low and continuous. The warmth was maintained by every means available. In a world without antibiotics, without aspirin or any reliable fever-reducing medicine, without a way to reduce a high fever quickly, without an understanding of bacterial infection that would explain what was actually happening, warmth and rest and hydration were in fact most of what could be done. The medieval mother doing these things was doing them correctly, by the simplest available evidence. The children who received this care often survived, and the survival was attributed to the care. The attribution was not entirely wrong. What a mother did by the fire, with the chamomile and the honey and the steady presence, was not the same as what the physician would later do with a prescription, but it was not nothing. It was the skilled application of everything the world had taught her about what bodies needed when they were fighting. A flat, smooth river stone heated in the fire and wrapped in a piece of wool cloth was placed at the child's feet. The warm stone maintained warmth in the extremities, eased the chill that accompanies fever, and gave the body one less problem to manage while it managed the larger one. No hot water bottle, no electric blanket, no aspirin dissolved in cool water, and definitely no calling a medical advice line at 2 a.m. to be told that plenty of fluids and rest were recommended. But the warm stone at the feet was doing approximately what those things do, with the materials that the world provided. The saints were present too. St. Nicholas was the patron of children and of scholars and of sailors, a saint of considerable range whose particular care for the young was well understood in every parish in England. A candle lit before his image was the household's petition to the dimension of things beyond ordinary remedy. Among the peasantry, this meant a walk to the church in the morning, the candle purchased from the sacristan and set in the holder before the saint's carved image, the prayer said quietly in the specific hope that it reached someone who could help. The pilgrimage to a healing shrine was the resort of the desperate, parents who had tried what was available and were willing to try the extraordinary. The miracle records of Becket's shrine at Canterbury, compiled by the monks with reasonable care over several decades, include a substantial number of children. Children who had been sick, whose parents had walked to the shrine, and who had recovered afterward. The parents attributed the recovery to the saint. The monks wrote it down. What is not in question is that the parents who walked to Canterbury with a sick child were not self-deceiving about the seriousness of their situation. They were doing what love requires when ordinary resources have run out. They were trying the thing that remained. The village wise woman was the primary resort before the extraordinary became necessary. The herbalist healer who served communities without a physician within accessible distance. She knew the plants. She knew the seasons. She knew which fevers broke on the third day and which ones did not, and she could read the signs that told the difference, signs that had been passed down from the woman who had the role before her. Her knowledge was empirical, built from what had actually happened to the people who had taken these preparations. The chamomile and the willow bark and the plantain. She got there by a different road, but she got there. By morning, the fever had broken. The child was sleeping the deep recovered sleep of a body that has fought something and won. You lifted her from the mattress and held her against your chest, her weight familiar and warm, the wool blanket pulled around you both. The cottage was quiet except for the fire's soft conversation with itself and the first bird outside, testing the light with a single note. The coral amulet, the small red piece on its cord around the child's neck, was the same red it had always been. You had been checking it through the night. Still itself. Still warm-coloured. You let out a breath you had apparently been holding for several hours. The morning came through the gap in the shutters, pale and unhurried, and entirely without interest in the night that had preceded it. The night was over. The child was warm and sleeping. The fire was going. These were the things that mattered, and they were all true, and that was enough for any morning. The experience of nursing a sick child through a night stood among the most formative experiences of medieval parenthood, repeated across many families, in many villages, in every season, across the whole of this long period. It left a mark that is visible in the evidence, in the wills that leave small sums to the healing saints, in the miracle records that document the gratitude of parents whose children recovered, in the penitentials that describe the grief of parents whose children did not. Medieval people felt the deaths of children. They grieved. The coroner's rolls show parents who threw themselves into the wells where their children had drowned, overcome by a grief that the modern reader recognizes without difficulty. The love was real. The loss was real. The relief on a morning when the fever had broken was real in the same proportion. The folk medicine that a medieval mother applied was not the only resource available, even for people of modest means. The apothecary, in a market town, kept a range of preparations that addressed common ailments, not with modern pharmaceutical precision, but with the products of long tradition and, in many cases, genuine efficacy. Ginger for nausea. Valerian for sleeplessness. Feverfew for headache. The preparations were dispensed by weight, measured on a small balance, priced by the material's scarcity. A course of treatment from the apothecary cost money that a peasant family might not easily spare, but it was available. The apothecary's shop was a world of small quantity precision in a period when precision of measurement was not universal. The apothecary measured in scruples and drachms on a delicate balance, wrote out the preparation in a hand that a literate person could read, and handed over a packet or a bottle with instructions that assumed the recipient knew how to follow them. In many cases, they did. The overlap between the household's medical knowledge and the apothecary's was significant. The same plants, the same properties, applied with somewhat more refinement. The difference was that the apothecary had access to materials that came from outside England entirely: spices from the East, gum resins from the Mediterranean, roots and seeds that no English garden could produce. These were the more expensive treatments, reserved for ailments that home remedies had not resolved. The decision to spend on them was a measure of how serious the illness had become. For the children of the wealthy, a physician might be consulted. A man trained at a university, working within the Galenic humoral framework, prescribing not herbs but dietary regimes and bloodletting, and the careful management of air, sleep, food, exercise, and the passions of the soul. By today's standards, the physician's training was extensive and his therapeutic toolkit was limited, and the connection between his theory and his outcomes was not always the one he thought it was. By modern standards, a practice built on bloodletting, dietary regimes, and the management of invisible humours would not meet the threshold of evidence-based medicine. But the framework produced, at least, a systematic attention to the patient's whole condition rather than a single symptom, and a consideration of the environment in which the sick person lived that modern medicine sometimes omits. The physician was expensive, imperfect, and in many cases the only recourse for the seriously ill child of a wealthy family. He came, he examined, he prescribed, he left. Whether he helped was a matter for the patient, the apothecary, the wise woman, the prayers, and the passage of time. The sick child who recovered grew up with the memory of the fire built high, and the warm stone, and the voice kept low and steady through the night. Not as something exceptional, because it was not exceptional in the medieval world, but as the ordinary experience of having been cared for, which is what it was. The ordinary experience of having been cared for is, in the end, one of the most important things a childhood can contain. You are 14 years old, and this morning you are standing in the manor court. The hall is a working hall, functional rather than grand, with a table at one end where the Lord's steward sits with the court roll open before him, a quill in his hand, and the expression of a man who has held this court for 20 years and has, over those 20 years, arrived at a professional peace with the absence of surprise. Around him stand the men of the manor, freeholders, customary tenants, villeins holding their strips and owing their week work. In the careful attentiveness of people who understand that presence at a legal proceeding is itself a form of participation, a standing acknowledgement that the court and its authority are real things in the world. You are here because your name is being added to the tithing. The tithing was the mechanism by which every free male above a certain age was enrolled in a group of 10 or 12 mutual sureties, each responsible for the other's presence and behaviour before the law. To be added to the tithing was to be inscribed in the community of adult men, legally present, legally accountable, legally capable of standing surety for another. Your father's name has been on the roll for more than 20 years. Today your name goes onto it beside his. The transition from child to legal person was accomplished through this administrative act, the quill forming the letters of your name in the steward's careful hand, the nod of the court, the moment of acknowledgement that required no ceremony beyond itself. For the peasant boy, this was the formal threshold. For the craftsman's son who had served his guild apprenticeship, the threshold was the journeyman's freedom. The day the indenture ended, 7 years complete, the master's household left behind, the skill now portable and entirely your own. The masterpiece, the piece of work submitted to the guild's wardens for their judgment, was the far end of that road, the formal demonstration that the knowledge had passed from master to apprentice and now resided fully in the apprentice's own hands. No examination board, no results letter, no graduation ceremony with a folder and a handshake. The work, the eyes on it, and the verdict. For the noble boy, the formal threshold was nominally the dubbing to knighthood, which could come at 21 or later, and the practical reality of adult responsibility had usually preceded it by several years. A lord's eldest son was managing portions of the estate in his mid-teens, sitting in the lord's seat when his father was away at court or at war, making decisions that affected real people and real assets. The ceremony acknowledged what the life had already become. For girls, the formal threshold was marriage. The wedding moved her from her father's household to her husband's, from one name and one allegiance to another. Canon law permitted girls to marry at 12, the age at which they were considered capable of genuine consent, though actual marriage among the labouring and farming classes usually waited considerably longer. Among peasant women, marriage in the mid-20s was common, not because of reluctance, but because marriage required a household to be established, and a household required resources, and resources required time. The years between childhood and marriage were spent in service in another household, earning wages, accumulating the goods and savings that would eventually make a new family viable. The girl who left service to marry at 24 had spent a decade working in the world, and the move into marriage was one more step in a process of becoming that had been underway for years. By today's standards, adulthood arrives with a cluster of formal markers: legal majority, university graduation, the first lease signed alone. By medieval standards, it arrived through accumulated obligation and the community's recognition of practical competence, not through any document. What all these thresholds had in common was that they acknowledged a transformation that had already happened gradually. They were not the moment of becoming. They were the naming of a becoming that was already complete. The peasant boy standing before the steward had been doing a man's work for 2 or 3 years before his name went on the roll. The journeyman had been competent in the craft for months before the indenture formally ended. The noble girl had been managing portions of the household well before the wedding arranged it formally. The threshold was the world's acknowledgement, and the world acknowledged formally, late, because the world is always slower than the life. The ending of childhood in the medieval world was not a line. It was a gradient, long and gradual, shaped by the particular details of social position and trade and family circumstance, but everywhere characterized by the same fundamental movement: the work growing heavier, the play growing rarer, the obligations accumulating one by one until one day you noticed that they outnumbered the freedoms by a margin that was not going to reverse. There was no birthday party specifically marking the transition, no certificate arriving in the post, no ceremony at which someone said, "Now you are an adult, and what was before is behind you." The change happened in the continuous texture of life. In the morning you woke up and the ploughing needed doing and you went and did it again the next morning, and the morning after that, until doing it was not something you thought about but simply something you were. The boy who had been bird scaring at 6 was ploughing at 14. The girl who had been turning a drop spindle at 5 was managing a household at 20. The child who had been shivering over a psalter at 8 was reading parchment documents in a bishop's chancery at 25. The change was continuous, and its beginning was invisible because it had no single beginning. It was the whole of growing up, which is to say it was the whole of life, from the swaddling to the tithing and beyond. The boy who stands in the manor court this morning, watching the steward's quill form the letters of his name, tries to remember when he last ran across the common with the bird-scaring clapper in his hand, making noise in the summer field, the rooks patient and watchful from the hedgerow. He cannot quite place it. 3 years ago, perhaps. The summer had been long and the sky enormous, and the work had been simple enough that there was room inside it for a child's mind to wander. The field, the birds, the blue air, the knuckle bones in the pocket for the afternoon. A game of 9 men's Morris scratched into the stone step of the church on the way home before supper called him in. The steward reads the name. You step forward. In the court's account, you are a man now, and the court's account is what matters here, in this hall, on this morning. The world is larger today than it was yesterday, heavier, more responsible, full of the obligations that adulthood carries alongside everything else. The memory of the field, the summer, the birds, the blue sky. That does not disappear. It settles, warm and quiet and complete, at the very bottom of everything. Like something put away carefully in the dark of a trunk, under the Psalms, for the long journey that lies ahead. It will be there for the rest of your life, exactly as it was. Not erased. Not replaced. Just very still. The transition to adulthood in the medieval world was, underneath all the formal mechanisms, a social process rather than a biological or psychological one. The community decided when you were an adult, through the mechanisms of the manor court and the guild and the marriage register and the household accounts, and the community's decision was based on practical evidence. Could you do the work, bear the obligation, fulfill the role? If the answer was yes, you were an adult, regardless of your age. If the answer was no, you were not, regardless of what the calendar said. This meant that the threshold was different for different children. The strong, capable boy who could plough well at 13 was effectively an adult by 14. The boy who struggled with the work, or who was slow to develop the physical strength it required, remained in a kind of extended middle state longer. The girl trained early, who had managed a household well at 19, was married and in her full adult role at 20. One who had less preparation, or who came from a household that expected less, moved into adulthood more slowly and with less certainty. The gradient differed for everyone. It was shaped by capacity and by expectation and by the specific circumstances of each particular life. What the medieval child shared, regardless of rank or trade or gender or circumstance, was the experience of a childhood that was also an apprenticeship. Not in the formal guild sense, but in the deeper sense of a period of sustained preparation for a specific adult role, conducted inside the world that role required, rather than in a separate educational space designed for children. You learned your life by living it, in the presence of the people who were already living it, in the specific place where it would be lived. The preparation was continuous, and the life was continuous, and the boundary between them was not a wall but a horizon. Always ahead of you, always approaching, never quite where you thought it was. The schoolboy who had been shivering over a psalter at 8 was sitting in a bishop's chancery at 25, reading documents that required the Latin he had learned in the cold stone room by the light of a master's candle. He could not have told you when, exactly, the shivering schoolboy had become the competent clerk. It had happened too gradually, across too many mornings of small incremental learning, for any single morning to be the one. The journeyman who had been a tongue-tied apprentice at 12 was handling commissions at 23 with the easy authority of a craftsman who knows exactly what they are doing and does not need to explain it. The woman managing the estate was the same person who had sat on the step with the drop spindle at 9, the same hands older and more capable, the same attention more practised, the same patience deepened by the years that had used it. The medieval self was continuous in a way that a culture that emphasizes transformation and reinvention might find difficult to recognise. You did not become someone else. You became more fully yourself, the self that the childhood had been building all along. The world those children were growing into was not a world that waited for them. It had work that needed doing and obligations that needed meeting, and it absorbed each new adult the moment they were ready to be absorbed, giving them, in exchange, the standing and the dignity that came with being fully present in the community's life. No longer the child carrying the water pail, but the person the community would call on, the person whose opinion at the court roll had weight, the person who would one day sit at the fire in the evening and tell the stories to the children listening from the corner. That was the whole arc of it. Childhood, tended and formed and worked and played through, arriving at last at adulthood, not as a destination but as a continuation, the same fire, the same fields, the same voice in the dark keeping watch. You step forward in the manor court. The steward's quill makes its quiet sound against the parchment. Your name is in the roll. Behind you, the village is waking to another morning. The fire is going in the cottage. The geese are beginning to stir. The birds are already in the grain field at the edge of the common, patient as they have always been, waiting for someone to come and drive them away. Somewhere, a 7-year-old is picking up a clapper from behind the door, going out into the pale morning, beginning the same work that you began at 7, that the person before you began, that the person before them began, the same work going back through the decades and the centuries, one generation of children replacing the next in the same field, under the same large sky, making the same necessary, noise against the same patient dark birds. The world continues. The children continue. The work continues. And the memory of it, which is also the memory of being a child in it, continues too. Very quiet, very warm, exactly as it was, available whenever you stop long enough to look for it. Now, with the night around you and the fire settled low, let the medieval world ease quietly into the background. You have spent this evening in the company of children, small ones bound in linen beside a fire, older ones running across frost-cold commons with hoops and animal bones, bent over wax tablets in cold schoolrooms, turning spindles in the morning sun, watching a sick child's face by firelight through a long night, standing before the steward for the first time with their name being written into the record. They were different from the children of any other age in the specific details of their days, and they were not different at all in the essential things, the need for warmth, the love of play, the slow and sometimes bewildering process of becoming something larger than you were. The medieval child's world was narrower, harder, more quickly demanding of grown-up effort than the world most of us have known. But it was also full of knucklebones and clay bird whistles and the sound of a nurse singing very softly in the dark, and the smell of wool carded in the morning sun, and a boy on a frozen pond going as swift as a bird in flight, laughing into the cold winter air, on bones strapped to his feet, with nowhere in particular to go, and the whole frozen afternoon ahead. The fire was the centre of everything. The voice in the dark was the first reassurance. Night by night, year by year, the world grew a little larger, and the children grew into it. You are warm enough. You are safe enough. You have come a long way already in your own becoming, and the night ahead is long and quiet and full of nothing you need to attend to. Let the remaining thoughts drift apart like ash lifted gently by the fire's draught, slow and light, going nowhere in particular. And so the story closes. The hearth holds its embers in the deep red that means warmth continuing through the dark hours. The walls hold the silence. The long night carries you gently down. Rest now as the medieval child rested, wrapped in what was available, held by what was warm, carried quietly toward morning. Sweet dreams.